The Vatican stating that Pope Francis has died on Easter Monday at 88 years old.
Pope Francis has died. That's come from the Vatican.
Pope Francis, who once shook the world with his humility and commitment to the poor, has passed away at the age of 88. But his final days weren't marked by spectacle or ceremony. They were quiet, private, and deeply personal. For decades, he rejected power, turned away from luxury, and vowed to die with nothing. But after his death, something unexpected surfaced. A paper trail of trusts, donations, and assets worth millions, all tied to his name. But what Francis left behind wasn't just a fortune. It was a mystery, a legacy he never claimed. Join us as we uncover shocking details that changes everything. Pope Francis, known for his deep commitment to serving the poor. Even as he rose through the ranks of the church, his lifestyle remained plain, his habits grounded in simplicity, and when he was elected pope in 2013, he stunned the world by choosing the name Francis. From the very first moment, Francis rejected the trappings of power. He declined the papal palace, opting instead for a two-room suite in a Vatican guest house. They were deeply personal choices that reflected the values he carried with him from Argentina. But it wasn't just his lifestyle that set him apart. He called for climate action, defended refugees, and challenged global capitalism in ways that unsettled political and financial elites. His message was consistent. The church exists to serve, not to dominate. That authenticity earned him admiration far beyond Catholic circles. Even non-believers saw him as a rare kind of leader, someone who wasn't interested in appearances, but in action, a man who practiced what he preached. That trust is what made global donors open their wallets in his name, often without asking too many questions about where the money was going or who was keeping track. They believed in him, and they believed their generosity would follow his values. But there lies far more complexity. While Pope Francis rejected luxury at every turn, his image became a symbol of trustworthiness. His humility wasn't just respected, it was marketed, and perhaps he became the face of causes that eventually tied his name to large-scale financial assets. To the public, Pope Francis represented everything the modern world was lacking in its leaders: humility, honesty, and an unwavering moral compass. But behind the scenes, the Vatican operates in ways very few understand. It is both a spiritual epicenter and a global power with historical influence. It owns banks, real estate, and manages billions through various internal departments. Throughout his papacy, Francis pushed for transparency. He criticized financial secrecy, called out internal corruption, and even ordered audits on the Vatican Bank. Yet ironically, while he preached reform, a separate financial network was forming quietly. As Pope, Francis didn't draw a salary in the traditional sense. Reports confirmed that any stipends or allowances offered to him were immediately redirected to charity. He had no private income, no bank accounts in his name, and no luxury possessions. But globally, countless individuals, foundations, and organizations were inspired by his mission. Moved by his authenticity, many chose to donate, some publicly, others anonymously. The amounts ranged from a few $100s to multi-million-dollar pledges. As time went on, these funds grew, and some were invested in stocks, others in real estate. By 2024, a Vatican-connected audit revealed that at least 3 of these funds, each inspired by Francis, and each outside Vatican jurisdiction, held combined assets of over $80 million. It was a stunning realization. The Pope, who never owned more than the shoes on his feet, was now posthumously linked to wealth he never requested, used, or even publicly acknowledged. Because while Francis may have lived and died in modesty, the financial network built around his name was anything but a deep mystery. And for those left behind, especially his family, that silence would soon turn into a heartbreak. While the world mourned the passing of Pope Francis, headlines spoke of legacy, reform, and spiritual leadership. But halfway across the world, his relatives were facing a different kind of reality, one far more personal, far more painful. For decades, many of his relatives lived on the edge of financial strain. Some worked in schools or administrative offices. Others ran small businesses, barely staying afloat during Argentina's economic downturns. A few quietly accepted help from local charities, ironically, the same types of charities Francis devoted his life to supporting. None of them had expected, or even hoped, for financial help from him. They believed him when he said he had nothing. They trusted that his life as Pope was one of sacrifice. They were proud of his choices, even if they came at a personal cost. So when reports surfaced linking his name to tens of millions in donor-created trusts and charitable accounts, the shock ran deep. Not because they believed he had secretly hoarded wealth, but because they realized something far worse. He may have been used. Their grief became entangled with questions after Francis's sudden death. Pope Francis passed away peacefully on April 21, 2025. Easter Monday. The Vatican quickly entered the traditional period of mourning known as sede vacante, during which the papal seat remains vacant until a successor is chosen. As per centuries-old protocol, the apostolic palace was sealed, the pope's ring was destroyed, and preparations began for the conclave that would elect the next spiritual leader of over 1 billion Catholics. The accounts tied to Pope Francis, those donor-backed trusts, foundations, and undeclared assets, could not simply be brushed aside. They existed, they were active, and their legal status had suddenly turned out to be very real. Complicating matters even further were internal documents suggesting Francis had begun exploring options to dissolve or redirect some of these trusts just months before his death. A draft letter, never finalized, indicated his wish for one fund to be repurposed entirely for medical aid in South America. Another proposed moving assets from a dormant education foundation into a climate initiative. But none of it had been officially executed. Without his signature on those final documents, the funds remained locked. Vatican officials were split on how to proceed. Some believed the Church had the moral right to absorb the trusts and ensure the money was used according to Francis's values. Others argued that doing so could lead to accusations of opportunities the Vatican had lost a pope. His family had lost a loved one. But what he left behind, unintended or not, was shaping up to be one of the most contentious inheritance mysteries the modern church has ever seen. The question seemed simple at first. If Pope Francis never touched the money, never spent it, never asked for it, was it ever truly his? Yet, the wealth that formed around his name wasn't fabricated. It was real, tangible, and legally documented. Multiple donor-established trusts, foundations, and accounts were created explicitly to carry out the work Francis had inspired. Francis, to his credit, seemed aware of the implications. Toward the final year of his life, he quietly began inquiring about some of the funds. He asked advisors about legal options for redistribution, drafted early-stage memos to dissolve at least one trust. But he never finalized anything. Perhaps he thought he had more time. Perhaps he didn't want to disrupt the balance of power he was already struggling to manage. Whatever the reason, he died before a clear plan could be put into place. And so now, lawyers and theologians are left with the burden he never meant to pass on. They're forced to debate a question no pope before him ever had to face. Can someone who lived in total poverty accidentally leave behind a fortune? And for his family, that question wasn't about philosophy. It was about grief. They believed he had nothing. They supported his decision to live simply. But now, they were being asked to accept that his name had been attached to millions, and that they may never know what he really thought about it. As the world tried to make sense of the wealth connected to Pope Francis, speculation took root. Some called it a misunderstanding, an innocent consequence of global admiration for a spiritual leader. Others weren't so sure. To them, this was more than a coincidence. This was calculated. The idea that such a vast fortune could grow, quietly, steadily, and completely outside Vatican control, set off alarm bells in some corners of the church and among financial watchdogs. These weren't untraceable bags of cash tucked away in obscure banks. These were formally registered trusts, complete with legal documentation, management teams, and defined beneficiaries. And yet, none had been publicly acknowledged until after Francis's death. The timing was suspicious. The legal ambiguity was troubling, and the lack of oversight raised one very uncomfortable question. Was someone using Pope Francis? Some insiders whispered that certain church figures may have turned a blind eye to the growing value of these trusts. After all, Francis was a global icon. Any financial effort bearing his name was bound to attract donors. And without the Pope himself closely monitoring these organizations, what stopped others from guiding them toward convenient purposes, laundering reputation, securing influence, or building a financial safety net for political leverage? The theory grew legs when investigators found inconsistencies in how some of the trusts reported their activities. One claimed to be supporting refugee resettlement, but had no records of projects. Another purchased properties in 3 different countries, though none of them had any clear humanitarian use. These weren't crimes necessarily, but they were red flags. Still, there's another side to this story, one that doesn't involve shadowy figures or strategic manipulation. Perhaps it really was an unintended consequence. Pope Francis was a man whose message resonated far beyond the pews. He inspired wealthy philanthropists and grassroots movements alike. It's possible these donors, eager to contribute to his mission, created foundations in good faith, hoping to amplify his vision. But good intentions don't always lead to good outcomes. Without a central body coordinating or vetting these efforts, the result was chaos, overlapping initiatives, scattered funds, and assets with no clear destination. Even worse, Francis himself may have been unaware of just how large these trusts had become. With so many layers between him and the financial mechanics, it's possible he never fully understood how much money had been tied to his image. Which begs the question, was he being misled? Or did he simply trust the people around him too much? Whatever the truth, the outcome remains the same. An immense fortune grew in his shadow, shaped by admiration, perhaps marred by mismanagement. Whether it was part of a quiet power play or an honest attempt at doing good that spiraled out of control, the end result is deeply ironic. The Pope who tried to avoid power found it accumulating around him anyway. And now, the weight of that unintended empire falls on the shoulders of the very people he tried to shield from the world's complexity. For a man who devoted his life to serving others, Pope Francis never seemed interested in legacy. He rarely spoke about how he wanted to be remembered. He wasn't concerned with statues, accolades, or monuments. In fact, he often warned against glorifying spiritual leaders, reminding people that the Church's mission was about action, not image. But now, whether he wanted it or not, Pope Francis leaves behind a legacy, one far more complicated than the world ever expected. The truth is, Francis was one of the most influential figures of the 21st century. He challenged world leaders, reshaped how billions viewed the Catholic Church, and became a symbol of compassion in a time dominated by division. But buried beneath the praise and prayer services following his death was an unsettling reality: the enormous financial web that had been woven around his name. None of it matched the values he lived by. The Pope, who wore hand-me-down shoes, had somehow become the spiritual face of trusts worth millions. The man who cooked his own meals had unknowingly given weight to investment portfolios and luxury assets, all built under the banner of faith. And as investigations pulled back the curtain, the contradictions grew harder to ignore. The Vatican remained largely silent, issuing broad statements about honoring Francis's mission, but avoiding any direct acknowledgement of the wealth controversy. The Church seemed eager to preserve his image, and perhaps even more eager to avoid deeper questions about how so much money was moved, managed, and maintained without oversight. Meanwhile, legal teams and trust administrators debated next steps, caught between civil law and spiritual expectations. Then there's the issue of the beneficiaries, or lack thereof. Unlike a traditional estate, the trusts weren't set up to benefit any one person. They were created to fund initiatives aligned with Francis's values. But without clear documentation, or without Francis himself to clarify intent, no one can say with certainty how the money should now be used. Some trust boards froze assets out of caution. Others began seeking court orders to repurpose the funds. A few even tried to return donations, fearing reputational damage. But no one could deny the most uncomfortable truth. Despite decades of rejecting materialism, Francis's name had become entangled in one of the most bizarre inheritance dilemmas in modern religious history. And through all of it, the family he left behind remained on the sidelines, grieving quietly, bewildered, and still largely in the dark. They never asked for money. They never expected an inheritance. But they did expect integrity. And for them, the lack of answers now weighs heavier than any sum ever could. This wasn't supposed to be his story. Not the one he lived, not the one he preached. And yet, in the end, his legacy became a paradox. A man who sought nothing, but left behind everything. Because somewhere between his values and the world's desire to hold on to them, something got lost. And now, that loss defines the final chapter of a life that never wanted one. Do you think Pope Francis knew about the money? Should his family have a right to it? And what do you think about Pope Francis's sudden death? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you liked the video, don't forget to like and subscribe for further updates.